Hello, everyone, and welcome back to East Asia Origins to 1800. Today, we've got the first of our chronological lectures, and we're going to be looking at China before unification. That is, before the Qin Dynasty, which takes control in 221 BCE. So, 22 centuries ago you get this unified dynasty. We'll be talking about a lot of different things over the course of this lecture, but let's begin with some very distant prehistory. So we know, of course, that all humans had their origins in East Africa and then moved to other places, including to China. And we know this in part because of the Human Genome Project, which has demonstrated all of those connections. It's a remarkable scientific achievement. And for a long time, scientists in China held for a separate origin, but today they acknowledge that we all have these shared roots. And the earliest human, as we refer to Peking man, is somebody who lived in northern China. We call him Peking man because of the location near Beijing. And this is Zhoukoudian, the cave where Peking man was discovered. And of course, it's really remarkable state of affairs to think about these earliest communities of Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, uh, more than a quarter of a million years ago. And one of the real interesting phenomena is that we lost Peking man. When I say we, neither you nor I were involved, but during World War II, he was turned over to the United States for safekeeping, part of the treasures that the United States took control over to prevent them falling into enemy hands. And as it happens, this was actually justified. One of the places where Peking man was being researched, in fact, was invaded by the Japanese, and some American lab technicians were held. Well, a few years ago, 13 years ago, it was determined that maybe, just maybe, there was this surviving US Marine who said, we uncovered as part of our defense preparations a little bit farther away from Beijing than this, closer to Tianjin, we uncovered a box of bones, and that could have been Peking man. And so researchers figured out where this was, and today it's a parking lot. So there's uncertainty still about where Peking man can be found. Uh, Archaeologists have turned up some remarkable finds to show that a couple million years ago, you had people creating tools. And so this is something that has come out in research in the 21st century, some of these artifacts. And in fact, just late last year, some new discoveries were shown. And these originated in a place called Shigo in north central China, present day Henan province. And these were tools that were part of a hafting technology. And what is meant by this is, you had these stones that were shaped and then attached to some kind of wooden or bamboo or antler so as to be used in various ways. And you have a demonstration of that in the picture at the lower right, where one of these things could have been used as an awl to drill into bamboo to do these kinds of things. And again, this was uncovered and published just last year. A multinational team of scholars made these discoveries. And my point here is not just that human beings have been roaming and working in present day China for a long time, but that we're still learning. And in fact, you and your students can be part of this, can talk about some of these things. What kinds of questions remain? What kinds of questions might be answered through this? And it is truly amazing that here in the 21st century, we're still uncovering things about this kind of technology that was being pioneered in China perhaps 160,000 years ago. You have readings on that. Now, one of the things that we get in China is the origin of these creation myths. And China actually is kind of late to create a creation myth. You get Nuwa, and Nuwa is created as this founding ancestor, but relatively late compared to some other founding myths, creation stories. But one of the things that we get are the stories about these culture heroes, somebody like Fu Xi, who is somebody who domesticates animals. We can see him wearing different skins. And then you have the notion of Shen Nong, and what this means basically is the god of farming, somebody who creates different technologies. Now, in fact, we don't know who was the first person to figure out the domestication of animals. That's the beginning of what we call agriculture today. But after that, then the cultivation of crops. These are important innovations, right? Once you start keeping animals, you don't have to hunt them. You don't have to chase them and track them down. You can have more sustained access to them. And the same thing with the cultivation of crops. You don't have to gather seeds and fruits and whatever you might find. You can raise it and manage it. And as a consequence, this can support larger populations, greater population density. And with that, you start to get other innovations, including supposedly this yellow emperor figure who creates Chinese medicine, the various ways that you can treat illnesses and diseases and injuries. These are all culture heroes. Now, there may have been key figures, and those figures might have been known to somebody, but today it's the invention that is celebrated, and they are seen as essential for the development of culture. Now, you have then these three famous rulers, Yao, Shun, and Yu, who achieve different things in sequence. And they are celebrated for their contribution to governance, for their devotion to duty. And so you get a figure like Yu, who is famous for working on water control and is so committed that even though his own family, he's been away from home for so long, his own family misses him terribly, but he, continues to stay on the job. And this is a remarkable story, and it's intended to convey something about responsibility, the duties of leadership. Let's pause for a minute, and you can hit pause on whatever you're playing this video on, and think about some of these questions. If they didn't exist, why invent them? Why create somebody to personify this technological, cultural step forward? Why is that useful? And think about other culture heroes. Would they differ? Would they be similar? Those kinds of things. And how could you bring this to life for your students? If you'd like, go ahead and take a moment to talk about this, write something down in the forum. We would love to have your comments there. Well, to continue on, when we look at the pre-unification, right, pre-Qin China, pre-imperial China. We have the Neolithic distant past, and we've been talking about that. Then we have the Shah dynasty. Now, the Shah dynasty has an asterisk by it because some argue that it's merely a legend. It's conveyed in stories, and in fact, there wasn't this centralized control. Now, as it happens, the Shang dynasty, if you were taking this class 120 years ago, many people would have talked about the Shang dynasty as a mythical thing, as something that could not be demonstrated. But archaeology has demonstrated that there was this Shang dynasty, that you had a central place of control, and that control extended far beyond the boundaries of the palace or even the capital city. Then we get the Zhou dynasty, and that falls into two big categories, Western Zhou, and this refers to the fact that the capital was located to the west of the later capital in present-day Xi'an, Chang'an, and Eastern Zhou, where the capital had moved to Luoyang, located to the east of Xi'an. And the Eastern Zhou is further divided into the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. And Chinese literature is very rich in stories about all of this. We won't have time to explore all of that, but we want to hit a couple of key points. Now, first among these is the notion of these Neolithic origins. And one of the things that we find is that we had the beginning of these civilizations in these river basins, these river valleys. Now, that's not unlike what we know about, the Middle East and in other places. Water is critical, and we certainly see that elsewhere in East Asia. Now, the earliest periods, we don't speak of these as dynasties because you don't have extensive areas of control, documents to make this case, some kind of record that shows uniformity. And instead, we use the term culture to describe what we have today, what the archaeological evidence shows. And it shows great variety. And so Yangshou culture, now this is 4,000 years BCE, so 6,000 years ago. And you can see these ceramics are already very sophisticated and are decorated in different ways. Now, most of these things, of course, played some sort of role either in ritual or in the ones that survived, probably in elite life because they were cared for in that way. Now, in Shanxi, in north central China, we have this Banpo village, and you can visit there and you can see this so-called Neolithic village that the Chinese government today has put together and get a sense of how people would have lived. Now, often pots would have had this kind of pointy end, and that was so that you could use it to cook. You could set it down in a fire, for example, to heat something up. In this case, this was probably used for storage, and you probably had some kind of rope that was attached to these little handles. But look at the variety. So in here on closer to the Chinese Pacific Ocean coast, you've got this splash of color from present-day Jiangsu province. And then this exquisite item from China's northwest. So you can see there's all kinds of things going on during these early millennia. Taosi, look at this fine and also very thin pottery at the top. And then we have on the right, looking down into this pot, here using this snake motif. Now, let's think about food for a bit and be mindful. Today, we generally associate rice, for example, with China. We also associate wheat with China, wheat for dumplings, for noodles, and we associate rice, of course, for a daily staple, these kinds of things. But early on, the dominant grain was millet. And this was especially true, that remained the dominant grain in the northern areas near the Yellow River and other areas like that. Farther south, where there was much more rain, much more water, you had the earlier emergence of wet rice. In the north, later millet. Millet continues all the way to today, but wheat becomes more dominant. You also get barley. Now, what is millet? For those who speak Chinese, this is your xiaomi, and this is what it looks like, right? Looks like at harvest time, and then if you've got this lovely bowl to display it. And rice, everybody's familiar with rice, but maybe you haven't seen it in the field. And that might be something to do with students to talk about these different grains and why rice becomes so dominant, not just in Asia, but elsewhere, is because rice is a superfood. It has much more caloric power than other crops. So, for example, sorghum or something like that in the north, easier to grow, more drought resistant, a hardy plant, but not nearly as packed. And today, also not nearly as favored by people as rice. And you've got all sorts of artistic renderings. This particular painting is from the 18th century, right? From the 1700s, showing rice cultivation. And of course, China has a long, long history of rice cultivation and achieves very high output. That's another feature of rice that makes it kind of a super competitor. If you have enough water, you can achieve big output. You can put more labor in. Now, what kind of vegetables? People were eating a kind of cabbage, they were eating turnips, they were eating a variety of different things. But in terms of fruit, one fruit that's native to China and has been used forever was the peach. And so here you have a 15th century painting of a essentially a first and second and first century BCE figure, Han Dynasty figure, this Dongfang Shuo, and he's holding a peach. And the name of the painting is an immortal holding a peach. And the peaches become a symbol of longevity. And so Chinese New Year, you'll often have paintings showing peaches, things like that. And then you've got the jujube, the cao, the Chinese date. And these have been around for a very, very long time. And this is a 12th century painting of people going to the jujube tree and getting these cao, getting the dates. Now, was there a Shah dynasty? That might be something to talk about with students. What qualifies a state to be referred to as this dynasty? And what are we looking for? Are we looking for an established capital? Are we looking for succession? Are we looking for the extent of its control? Now, for those who are convinced, and in China, there's no debate anymore about a Shah dynasty. A Shah dynasty officially existed. And what this essentially means is that there was extensive and in some form or fashion documented with physical evidence as well as stories that appear in the history records and other records that we have from this period. This is a long time ago. This is 4,000 years ago that we're talking about. And you have archaeological evidence making this case. And as I say, in China today, it's taught that there was a Shah dynasty. This is still not the norm in the United States, but that could change. As I say, 130 years ago, people in China, people outside of China, saw the Shang dynasty as more story than fact. And that has changed as more has come to light. Now, if we look 4,000 years ago, you already have exquisite works of jade, such as this ritual knife that was produced, again, 4,000 years ago in this area that we call Arlito. So this Arlito culture. And this is truly amazing. And so you have the Shang dynasty, and dates can vary on this. Maybe the 18th century BCE, so 20 centuries ago, all the way to the 12th century BCE, 14 centuries ago. And there's been a lot of research documenting now the urban centers of the Shang. And so we know a lot more about this than we once did. And so this, again, is the point about your students may be on the cutting edge in the future, helping us to better understand this ancient world and its connection to the world that you and I occupy. Now, during the Shang dynasty, you had the use of oracle bones. And oracle bones and tortoise shells, essentially, you're looking at the scapula of ox as well as these tortoise shells. These were used in divination. So, ritual specialists, priests, as it were, they would be able to ask questions, carve questions into these bones, and then you heat them up and they crack in a particular way. And if you're a ritual specialist, you know how to interpret that crack. And so these oracle bones are a source of history as well, because we have the question, we also have the determination of the ritual specialist as to what this means. And we have translated versions of these. Not all have been translated. Very difficult to fathom this. You will be able to recognize some characters for the Chinese readers among us, but others not so much. You'll have queries about, what kind of ritual should be performed. How many goats, for example, ought to be sacrificed for a particular ritual, but also questions of national security. Is this a good time to attack? Whether or not a battle should be launched at this juncture. So interesting things. Now, one of the things that we want to be very clear about is that this is a query from the powerful, essentially from the Shang rulers, to heaven. And heaven it's not too clear. You have Shangdi, okay, God or gods. And the Shang rulers argued that we can ask Shangdi for answers, and we can get good answers because what? Because our ancestors are on especially good terms with Shangdi. And what that means is that there's this connection, and we rule through this charismatic connection, this kind of rule. And so we justify our place in power by saying our ancestors have a direct connection, and we can ask questions and get good answers from Shangdi, okay, from the gods or from God. And this is a fascinating time. You have all of this exquisite work, this jade work, some that has been pulled out of this particular tomb of a noble woman, Fu Hao. And you can see it's located in north central China, on the North China Plain, as it were, where these things have been uncovered. But look at the artistry on this. Really quite amazing. But what most people think about when they think about the Shang dynasty, they think about these metalworks, these bronze works, because of course, this represents high tech to be able to turn these things out, right? To, mine the ore, melt it down, and then put it into these molds, cool it, control it, and have these incredible works, of bronzes. And so this is an example. And in the Shang Dynasty, you have a lot of these symmetrical patterns. Sometimes the patterns are animals, occasionally human beings. It's different from Greece. There's much more emphasis on these animals or these patterns. And here you get this bell, and again, quite elaborate design on these. Here, look at this bird design. And this probably would have been used to store wine. And it would have, obviously the ordinary people didn't have this. This was reserved for the elite of the elite. Only they could have the wherewithal to mobilize the labor to produce works such as this. And of course, works like this are much more likely to survive than ceramics, which are much more easily broken, and some other objects. But look at this ram head, and even the face of the lamb has these elaborate designs on it. These are exquisite works of art, and you do have occasionally these human representations. This particular human mask. Now, one of the things that I was always interested in is this place called Shanxingdui. And you've got there this particular figure. And I didn't read it carefully enough when I was first looking at pictures of this particular object, and especially the gilded mask for this figure. I thought maybe it was small, maybe 10 inches tall, something like that. It's not. I finally got to Shanxingdui, and it's better than 6 feet tall, really extraordinarily large. And so this is in the museum, this bronze work. And you can see that Sanxingdui is located in southwest China. So this seems to be quite a distance from that center of power. And so this bronze technology was not limited to one place and one time. It becomes diffused. And that, of course, again, speaks to the connection, to the extent of control that was exerted by the Shang dynasty. The Shang, though, get pushed aside. They get pushed aside by the Zhou group. And the Zhou group, they were located close, and they had been part of the area that was controlled by the Shang, but they fought. And so you had Kings Wen and Wu, who ultimately will defeat the Shang. And it's King Wu who ultimately defeats the Shang. And here we have a much later painting representing King Wu, the martial king, is one way to translate this. And one of the striking things is that when they write history, and remember, the victors get to write history, those that survives get to describe their predecessors and themselves. And so the Zhou report that, the Shang dynasty started out strong, but the last ruler was craven and inattentive to the needs of the area under his control. He gave in to personal whim rather than taking care of business, as it were. And that's why we are now in charge, because we have the mandate of heaven. Tianming, we have been chosen by heaven. And this represents a significant change from the Shang dynasty. In the Shang dynasty, Shangdi is seen as indifferent to what goes on earth. And the Shang rulers argue that they can get answers from Shangdi not because he especially cares what happens on earth, but because Shangdi is approachable by the Shang ancestors that they're able to appeal to him in this particular way. Now, that's a disinterested God. The Zhou argue that God cares, that God has standards, God has expectations, or not God, but heaven. Because now there's much less talk about Shangdi, much more talk about Tianming, about heaven, Tian. The notion that heaven is interested, heaven has desires for peace and harmony and prosperity, and that's why they now have power. And this becomes the ruling justification for 3,000 years in China. And it's an amazingly efficient bit of legitimation, right? I have power because I should have power, because heaven wants me to have power. That's the message in the mandate of heaven idea. And that comes down from the Zhou dynasty in about, let's just say, 11, between 1200 and 1100 BCE. And that survives in many respects to the present day, that we deserve power. We ought to have power. And this is really quite an efficient technique. Now, you do see some ideas about Chinese perspective in terms of painting. The main figure, King Wu, King Wu is large, and the others are smaller, and that will be coming through as well. So you see that the Zhou dynasty expanded its area of control. And during the Zhou, you also have the promotion of this idea that the ruler ought to rule all under heaven, that heaven has authorized this. Now, today, of course, we understand the world is a much larger place than what they knew about during the Zhou dynasty. But they were saying all under heaven, that is the natural order of things, that all under heaven ought to be governed by those who what? Have the mandate of heaven. And so this is part of this justification. But you get some sense of how much bigger the Zhou dynasty was. Now, in fact, Zhou control was fairly loose. It was a kind of feudalism, a kind of patrimonialism, where various states were, self-governing in many respects, although they pledged loyalty to the Zhou rulers. Now, another idea that comes out in the early Zhou dynasty that would be perpetuated, particularly by Confucius and his followers, is the notion of the key role of a chief bureaucrat, of a prime minister, the Duke of Zhou Gong. And for Confucius, this guy is the real hero. So the monarchs rule because it's inherited, but the Duke of Zhou serves because that's his duty. That he's virtuous and he has this obligation to deliver. And today in China, you can go to a reconstruction of the Zhou ruler. So the Duke of Zhou had his offices in this particular city, and they've recreated some portion of that. And so you've got the Duke of Zhou, oracle bones, inscriptions, things like this about this. Now, during the Zhou dynasty, of course, the bronze work continues, but you move to kind of exquisite works such as this, and think about that very fine and narrow object, and how much more difficult it would be to make something like this than something that's 2 inches thick. Now, when you make something that's 2 inches thick, you can also create a very ornate piece, and we see that during the Zhou dynasty. Look at these. Now, this we mentioned earlier that you have the Western Zhou centered on present-day Xi'an, what was then called Chang'an, the city of everlasting peace, and that in roughly the 8th century BCE, the capital is moved from Xi'an to Luoyang. Now, these are both in this north central area. They're today in two different provinces, but you get some sense of that. And these are Yellow River, part of the Yellow River civilization. And it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that this is that North China dominance. Now, you did already start to have extensive societies in the South, and we saw that in southwestern China with San Qingdui, but you also see it in southern areas where you have elaborate cultures develop, written cultures, producing all kinds of poetry. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that we associate that Great Wall of China with the first emperor. But it's important to note that actually during this period, everybody's building walls. All the different states are building walls, the Zhou build walls, and they're trying to keep potential enemies on the other side of things. And you can see different bits of archaeological evidence of this if you're interested in doing so in China. But this is an important consideration. And again, you've got bells, you've got music culture, wine would have been stored here for ritual celebrations. And again, check this out, that on the top of this, you have this elaborate decoration. Now, what happens eventually by, the fourth, the third century BCE is that these states become rivals for power. They're no longer taking their lead from the Zhou dynasty, and now they're pushing. Now, in the early going, people thought maybe because Chu was so large and sophisticated and prosperous because it had more developed agriculture, things like that. But we see that it's these Western folks, the Qin, that are ultimately going to take power. But it's not going to happen right away. And you have these competing states. And so this is this era called the Warring States period. And of course, there are all kinds of stories that come out of this. And today we have video games based on different parts of this. You have chariots. And in fact, the Shang dynasty, you had chariots as well. And one of the things that will happen is technological change will make chariots less effective. And the technological change that's key here is the creation of the crossbow, which can take out a chariot rider at great distance. And so this is, again, one of these ways in which technology will ultimately determine, winners and losers, who can develop the most effective, in this case, military technology. But this might have also applied for those who are working in the economic space, people who are able to get more from less land, people who are able to manage those affairs a good deal better. Now we have artifacts from the Warring States period, in some cases, swords that would have actually been used in battle, and others were ceremonial, more decorative. Now, let's pause and think, okay, what do we do with this? How can we bring this up with our students? What can we talk about with them to have them begin to make sense of this and begin to think in terms of how this, reveals something about societies, the challenges societies have, how they organize themselves. Take a moment. If you choose to, go ahead and post something in the discussion forum, but we'll pick things up in just a second. Okay, we're back. And in the late Zhou dynasty, okay, so this would be this Eastern Zhou period, the spring and autumn period. This is the period where you get Confucius and his predecessors, as well as his successors. And we'll be talking in a bit about Chinese philosophy. We have a whole separate lecture about Chinese philosophy, and you're going to be asked to play a role in a historical debate among the four major schools of Chinese thought. But we get these writings. Now, today, of course, they're preserved on paper, but at this time, there was paper did not yet exist. That would be invented a little bit later. But they're recording these stories, these uh, philosophical treatises on bamboo, pieces of bamboo. And you would carve the characters in or write the characters on these. And then you would what? They would be tied together with thread and then wrapped up. And so today, when we talk, when we're talking about traditional works and things like that, Chinese use this term juan for like a chapter. For a particular selection. And it refers to this kind of idea that would be wrapped and rolled and that you would unroll it. And you can see these kinds of things. Now, these classics, of course, remain with us, and these are the so-called five classics. The Book of Changes, the Book of Odes. Um, Odes is the book of songs. The Book of Documents, this is, your history. The Book of Rites, the Li Ji, this is something that gets emphasized over and over by Confucius that we have to get rituals right. And then the Spring and Autumn Annals, the stories of that, 5 century period of Chinese history. Supposedly, these were edited by Confucius, but they were probably assembled by others. But having Confucius sign off as these are these five classics is critical. And this becomes part of the standard curriculum for those who would like to consider themselves educated and perhaps serve in government as scholar officials. Now, here we also have this competing tradition in the South, the Songs of Chu. And these are really quite interesting as well. And so we have, for example, this lament. All others press forward in greed and gluttony, nor surfeit satiating their demands, forgiving themselves but harshly judging others. Listen to this stinging criticism. And madly they rush into covetous chase, but not after which my heart sets store by. They're chasing things that I don't value, right? And what does he want? He wants to leave behind an enduring name. He wants to be recognized as a person of virtue, not somebody who was envious, not somebody who was malicious, that sort of thing. And who are we talking about? We're talking about Chu Yuan. Chu Yuan, this figure from this period 340 278 BCE, and he supposedly commits suicide. He's so distraught by holding a rock and walking into the water. And this story continues today. And in fact, we have these dragon boat races to honor him and to honor his memory. And people talk about, tossing the congzi into the water. This rice that might be meat, there might be something sweet inside it, and then steamed in a bamboo leaf. This really exquisite treat. And of course, the dragon boat races have migrated all the way to the United States. And so here we have a picture of folks in Texas with dragon boat competition. We have them in California. Maybe you have them where you're at as well. So take a moment and think, why come up with this core curriculum? What's going to be here? And why perpetuate it? Why make it a Jing, a classic that must be mastered? And so think about how this comes into being. What is important to know? How is it conveyed? And that brings us to the end of our China before the Qin dynasty discussion. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to seeing you all very, very soon. And when we meet next in terms of video lecture, we'll be talking about Chinese philosophy. And each of you will be preparing for a role play where you need to represent your school of thought and represent it well. Thank you.